The cold wind sliced through Lillian O'Connor's worn coat as she trudged along the moonlit path, her arms laden with firewood that seemed to grow heavier with each step. Whispers and jeers followed her like shadows as she passed the saloon where the townsfolk of Silver Creek gathered each evening, their laughter cutting deeper than the winter chill of 1872. "There she goes again," a voice called out, loud enough for her to hear. Crazy Lillian, fetchin' wood in the dead of night like some kind of witch. Lillian kept her head down, her knuckles white against the rough bark. The townsfolk would never understand her reasons, and she had long since stopped trying to explain. They had already decided who she was, the strange young woman who lived alone at the edge of town, who kept to herself and carried firewood when decent folk were tucked safely in their beds. 23-year-old Lucas Kane leaned against the hitching post outside the saloon, watching the scene unfold with quiet intensity. He had arrived in Silver Creek just 3 days prior, seeking work at the nearby ranch owned by the Henderson family. Unlike the others, he didn't join in the mockery. Instead, he observed the determined set of the young woman's shoulders, the dignity with which she carried her burden despite the cruel words being hurled her way. "What's her story?" he asked Walter, the elderly storekeeper who stood nearby smoking his pipe. "That's Lillian O'Connor," Walter answered, his voice neither kind nor unkind, simply matter of fact. "Lives in her pa's old cabin since the fever took him last winter. Odd one, always has been. Gathering wood at night, talking to herself. Some say she's touched in the head." Lucas watched as a young cowhand deliberately stepped into Lillian's path, causing her to stumble. The firewood tumbled from her arms, scattering across the muddy street. Laughter erupted from the saloon entrance where several men had gathered to watch. Without hesitation, Lucas straightened and strode forward. He knelt beside Lillian, who was frantically trying to gather the fallen wood, her fingers trembling. "Allow me, miss," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the sudden hush that fell over the onlookers. Lillian looked up, her green eyes wide with surprise and wariness. "I don't need help," she whispered fiercely, though her voice wavered. "Especially not from someone who'll mock me tomorrow." "I'm not one for mocking," Lucas replied, already stacking the wood in his arms. "And I reckon a person's got their reasons for doing what they do." The cowhand who had caused Lillian to stumble stepped forward, his boots loud in the silence. "Don't waste your time, mister. She's just the town crazy." Lucas rose slowly to his full height, the firewood cradled in his strong arms. He turned to face the group of men, his expression calm but his eyes hard as flint. "That's the woman I'll marry someday," he stated clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. Stunned silence fell over the crowd. Lillian's mouth dropped open in shock. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice barely audible. Lucas handed her the neatly stacked wood. "No, madam, I don't, but I know courage when I see it. And anyone who walks with their head high while others try to bring them low is someone worth knowing." With that, he tipped his hat to her and turned back to the dumbfounded crowd. "Evening, gentlemen," he said with a nod before walking away, leaving whispers and confusion in his wake. Lillian stood frozen, the wood once again secure in her arms, watching the tall stranger disappear into the night. For the first time in months, the weight she carried felt just a little lighter. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, the autumn sun casting long shadows across Silver Creek. Lillian rose early, as was her habit, to tend to her small flock of chickens and the single milk cow that had been her father's pride. Her cottage sat on the outskirts of town, nestled against the edge of the forest that crept down from the mountains. It was a humble place, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, but it was hers, the only home she had ever known. As she scattered feed for the chickens, her mind kept returning to the stranger from the previous night. His words had been shocking, inappropriate even, yet something about the quiet certainty in his voice had stayed with her through the restless night. "That's the woman I'll marry someday." The absurdity of it almost made her laugh aloud. What kind of man declared such a thing about a complete stranger? A madman, perhaps, or a troublemaker looking to stir the pot. Lillian sighed, brushing a loose strand of auburn hair from her face. She had more important matters to attend to than dwelling on the words of some passing cowboy. The winter would be upon them soon, and she needed to ensure her supplies would last. After finishing her morning chores, she gathered her basket and headed into town for the weekly visit to Walter's general store. The walk was always an exercise in endurance, the stares, the whispers, the occasional outright insult. Today was no different as she made her way down the main street, eyes fixed firmly ahead. Walter's store was mercifully empty when she entered, the little bell above the door announcing her arrival. The old shopkeeper nodded in greeting, his weathered face impassive. "Morning, Lillian," he said, continuing to stock shelves. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton," she replied politely. "I've come for my usual." She moved through the store efficiently, gathering the few items she could afford: flour, salt, a small amount of coffee. She was examining a bolt of fabric, calculating whether she could spare the money to mend her winter coat when the bell rang again. Lucas Kane stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. Sunlight caught the angles of his face, revealing features that were handsome without being pretty: a strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes the color of a summer sky. His light brown hair was neatly trimmed. Unlike many of the rough cowboys who passed through Silver Creek, their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Walter looked between them with undisguised curiosity. "Miss O'Connor," Lucas finally said with a respectful nod. Lillian clutched her basket tighter. "Mr. Kane, is it?" she asked, recalling the name she'd heard mentioned this morning as she passed the smithy. "Lucas Kane," he confirmed. "I hope I didn't cause you any additional trouble last night." She lifted her chin slightly. "I'm quite accustomed to trouble, Mr. Kane." Your words were unexpected but not unwelcome in their intention to silence the others. A slight smile touched his lips. It wasn't just about silencing them. Walter cleared his throat loudly. "Need anything today, Kane?" "Mr. Henderson sent word you'd be picking up some supplies for the ranch." Lucas turned to the shopkeeper. "Yes, sir, I have a list here." He produced a folded paper from his pocket. As Walter busied himself gathering the items, an awkward silence fell between Lillian and Lucas. She moved to the counter to pay for her purchases. "I gather you're working for the Hendersons," she said finally, feeling oddly compelled to continue the conversation. Lucas nodded. "Started this week. They needed an experienced ranch hand who knows horses. And do you know horses, that is?" "Been working with them since I was tall enough to reach a stirrup," he replied. "My father raised quarter horses back in Texas." Lillian found herself genuinely interested. "What brings you to Silver Creek, then? It's hardly the center of horse trading." A shadow seemed to pass over his face. "Change of scenery, I suppose. Needed to move on after some difficulties back home." She recognized the careful evasion. She employed similar tactics when people pried too deeply into her own circumstances. "Silver Creek has its fair share of difficulties too," she warned. "As you witnessed last night, every place has its troubles," he said with a shrug. "It's how people face them that matters." Walter returned with Lucas's supplies, and Lillian took the opportunity to pay for her items. As she was leaving, Lucas spoke again. "Miss O'Connor," he called after her. "I meant no disrespect with what I said last night, but I also wasn't joking." She paused at the door, aware of Walter's unabashed eavesdropping. "Mr. Kane, you don't know the first thing about me." "I'd like to," he replied simply. Lillian didn't know how to respond to such directness. Men in Silver Creek either ignored her entirely or treated her with contempt. This straightforward interest was unfamiliar territory. "I gather firewood at night, Mr. Kane," she finally said. "That's all most people need to know about me to form their opinions." He leaned against the counter, those blue eyes studying her with unsettling perception. "I'm not most people, Miss O'Connor." "No," she agreed quietly. "I don't believe you are." With that, she stepped outside into the sunlight, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She had nearly reached the end of the street when she heard footsteps behind her. "Miss O'Connor," Lucas called, catching up to her with long strides. "Allow me to carry that for you." She clutched her basket closer. "That's not necessary." "I know it's not necessary. I'm offering all the same." Lillian stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Mr. Kane, I don't know what game you're playing, but I should warn you that associating with me will do you no favors in this town." He seemed genuinely confused. "Game? There's no game, Miss O'Connor." "Then what is this?" she demanded. "Why would you say such a thing last night? Why are you pursuing this conversation now?" Lucas studied her for a moment before answering. "Because I saw something in you that reminded me of myself, someone who doesn't fit the mold that others try to force them into." He paused. "And because I've never seen anyone carry firewood with such dignity." Despite herself, Lillian felt a smile tug at her lips. "You have a peculiar way of complimenting a lady, Mr. Kane." His own smile broadened in response. "So I've been told." He gestured to her basket. "Now will you allow me?" After a moment's hesitation, she handed him the basket. They walked in silence for a while, the town gradually thinning out around them as they approached the path to her cottage. "May I ask you something, Miss O'Connor?" Lucas finally said. "You may ask, I may not answer." "Fair enough." He adjusted the basket in his hands. "Why do you gather firewood at night?" Lillian had expected the question, yet still found herself unprepared to answer. Most people simply assumed she was odd or touched in the head, as Walter had put it. No one had directly asked her reasons before. "It's cooler then," she said finally, offering the simplest of her many reasons. "And quieter. I can hear the forest better." "Hear the forest?" She glanced at him, expecting to see mockery, but found only genuine curiosity in his expression. "The sounds," she explained. "Animals moving, wind in the trees. During the day, it's all drowned out by people." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. Back home, I used to ride out before dawn sometimes, just to hear the world wake up." They had reached her cottage now, the small structure standing sentinel at the forest's edge. Lucas took in the well-maintained garden, the neat stack of firewood, the small barn where she kept her animals. "You manage all this alone?" he asked, and there was respect in his voice rather than the pity she so often heard. "Since my father passed last winter," she confirmed, taking the basket from him. "Thank you for carrying this, but I can manage from here." Instead of leaving, Lucas surveyed the property with a critical eye. "Your barn roof has a weak spot," he observed. "Might not last through winter snows." Lillian sighed. "I'm aware. I haven't had the time or resources to repair it properly." "I could help," he offered immediately. "I've built and repaired plenty of structures." She regarded him suspiciously. "Why would you do that?" "Because it needs doing, and I have the skills to do it," he replied simply. "I can't pay you. I'm not asking for payment." Lillian set her basket down on the porch step. "Mr. Kane, I don't accept charity." "It's not charity, it's neighborliness," he countered. "And if it makes you feel better, you can feed me dinner in exchange for the work." She found herself at a loss for words. The roof did need fixing before winter, and she had been worrying about how to manage it alone. "One dinner hardly seems equivalent to repairing a roof," she finally said. Lucas smiled, and something warm flickered in his eyes. "Depends on the dinner, I suppose, and the company." Against her better judgment, Lillian found herself agreeing. "Very well. Sunday after church, I'll be here," he promised, placing his hat back on his head. "And I'll bring the necessary supplies." As he turned to leave, she called after him. "Mr. Kane." He looked back, eyebrows raised in question. "People will talk," she warned. Lucas Kane's smile was unconcerned. "Let them. I've never much cared for the opinions of people who have nothing better to do than judge others." With a tip of his hat, he started back down the path. Lillian watched him go, a strange feeling settling in her chest, something like hope, but more fragile, more cautious. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her and seen something other than crazy Lillian. She picked up her basket and went inside, telling herself not to read too much into the kindness of a stranger. Men had ulterior motives. Her father had warned her often enough. Yet try as she might, she couldn't quite dismiss the sincerity she had seen in Lucas Kane's blue eyes. That night, as she ventured into the forest to gather wood, she found herself listening not just to the sounds of the night, but also for footsteps that might indicate she wasn't alone. Part of her almost hoped to encounter Lucas again, though she chided herself for the foolish thought. The forest was her sanctuary, the one place where the whispers and stares couldn't reach her. Here, among the ancient trees and watching stars, she could breathe freely. She could remember her mother's teachings without fear of being labeled a witch or worse. Her mother had been a healer, knowledgeable in the ways of plants and their medicinal properties. She had taught Lillian to respect the forest, to take only what was needed, and to give thanks for nature's bounty. In the years since her mother's death, Lillian had continued to practice these beliefs, gathering herbs by moonlight when their properties were strongest. It was this not madness that drove her into the forest at night. But such practices were viewed with suspicion in a town like Silver Creek, where anything unfamiliar was treated as threatening. It was easier to be thought eccentric than dangerous, so Lillian had never corrected the assumptions about her nocturnal activities. As she gathered fallen branches, her thoughts kept returning to Lucas Kane and his inexplicable interest in her. Perhaps he was simply kind. Perhaps he genuinely saw something in her that others missed. Or perhaps he had motives she couldn't yet discern. Whichever it was, Sunday would reveal more of his character. Until then, she would do what she had always done: tend her home, care for her animals, and survive another day in a town that had never truly accepted her. Sunday arrived clear and bright, the kind of autumn day that hinted at winter's approach while still clinging to the memory of summer. Lillian attended church as she always did, sitting in the back pew, ignored by most of the congregation. She noticed Lucas several rows ahead, seated with the Henderson family. Once, during a hymn, he glanced back and caught her eye, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. After the service, as people gathered outside to socialize, Lillian slipped away, as was her custom. She had preparations to make for Lucas's visit, and she preferred to avoid the thinly veiled hostility that often followed her interactions with the townsfolk. Back at her cottage, she set about preparing the best meal she could with her limited resources: a rabbit stew with vegetables from her garden, fresh bread, and apple pie made with fruit from her single, struggling apple tree. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest food, prepared with care. She had just removed the bread from the oven when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Through the window, she saw Lucas dismounting from a handsome chestnut gelding. He had loaded the animal with supplies: lumber, tools, and what appeared to be additional items covered by a tarp. Lillian smoothed her dress her Sunday best, the only one without patches, and stepped onto the porch to greet him. "Right on time, Mr. Kane," she called. He secured his horse to the hitching post and approached with a smile. "I make it a point to be punctual, especially when there's a home-cooked meal involved." She noticed he had changed from his church clothes into work attire, though he still looked more put together than most of the ranch hands in the area. "I should get started on that roof," he said, glancing up at the barn. "Looks like we've got good weather for it." "Would you like some coffee first?" she offered. "That would be welcome, thank you." Inside the cottage, Lucas took in his surroundings with interest. The main room was small but meticulously clean, with a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair beside the hearth. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a small bookshelf held a surprising number of volumes. "You're a reader," he observed as she poured coffee into 2 chipped cups. Lillian nodded. "My mother taught me, and my father encouraged it. They believed education was important, even for a girl." "Especially for a girl, I would think," Lucas replied, accepting the coffee. "Knowledge is power, regardless of who possesses it." She studied him with renewed interest. "That's not a common view around these parts." "I've never been one for common views," he said with a slight smile. "My own mother was educated. She taught school before she married my father." Lillian gestured for him to sit at the table. And what of your parents now? A shadow crossed his face. Both gone. My mother 5 years ago from pneumonia, my father 2 years passed in an accident with a horse that should never have happened. He took a sip of coffee. Your stew smells wonderful. She recognized the deflection but didn't press. Thank you. It should be ready by the time you've finished with the roof. She hesitated. I notice you brought quite a lot of supplies. Better to have too much than too little, he replied. The damage looked more extensive than a simple patch job. After finishing his coffee, Lucas headed out to the barn. Lillian watched from the window as he unloaded his supplies and set to work with confident efficiency. He clearly knew what he was doing, measuring and cutting lumber with precision, climbing onto the roof with sure-footed ease. As the afternoon progressed, Lillian found herself inventing reasons to step outside, gathering herbs from her garden, checking on her chickens, bringing Lucas water. Each time he would pause in his work to exchange a few words with her, his manner friendly but respectful. You've done this before, she commented as she watched him secure a new beam. Many times, he affirmed. Started helping my father build when I was 12. He believed a man should know how to construct his own shelter. A practical belief, she agreed. My father was the same, though his talents ran more to farming than building. Lucas wiped sweat from his brow. Is that how you learned to maintain this place? From your father, partly, she acknowledged, and partly from necessity. When you live alone, you either learn to do things yourself or they don't get done. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. I know something about that. Been on my own since my father died. No siblings, a sister, married and living in San Francisco with her husband and children. He smiled briefly. Catherine writes regularly, always trying to convince me to move west and join them. Why don't you? Lillian asked, genuinely curious. Lucas returned to his work, hammering a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. Never been one for city living, and I suppose. Well, I've been looking for something, though I couldn't tell you exactly what. She understood the feeling all too well. And you think you might find it in Silver Creek? That seems unlikely. He paused, looking down at her from the roof. I think I might have already found it, he said quietly, his eyes holding hers. Heat rose to Lillian's cheeks and she turned away. I should check on the stew, she murmured, retreating to the safety of her cottage. Inside, she leaned against the closed door, her heart beating rapidly. What was happening to her? She had built careful walls around herself over the years, protection against the cruelty and indifference of others. Yet somehow this stranger, this Lucas Kane, was finding cracks in those defenses without even trying. By late afternoon, the roof was repaired, looking sturdier than it had in years. Lucas had even reinforced some of the barn's structural supports that had begun to weaken with age. It should withstand whatever winter brings now, he said with satisfaction as he washed up at the pump outside. I don't know how to thank you properly, Lillian said, genuinely moved by his generosity. This would have taken me weeks to do on my own if I could have managed it at all. The promised dinner will be thanks enough, he assured her, drying his hands on a towel she offered. Though I have brought something else that needs addressing. He went to his horse and removed the tarp covering the additional supplies he had brought. Underneath was a pile of neatly split firewood, far more than she could have gathered in several nights. Mr. Kane, she began, overwhelmed by the gesture. Lucas, he corrected gently. And before you refuse it as charity, consider it payment for the excellent meal I'm about to enjoy. Lillian shook her head, torn between gratitude and pride. No meal is worth that much wood. Perhaps not, he agreed, but your safety is. She looked at him sharply. My safety? Lucas's expression grew serious. The forest isn't always kind, especially at night. I'd rest easier knowing you don't need to venture out as often for wood. I've been gathering wood at night for years without incident, she pointed out, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. And I admire your capability, he assured her. But that doesn't mean I can't wish to ease your burden somewhat. The genuineness in his voice disarmed her protest. No one had expressed concern for her welfare in so long that she hardly knew how to respond to it. Thank you, she finally said simply. That was thoughtful of you. They carried the wood together, stacking it neatly alongside her existing supply. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. Inside, Lillian served the stew, along with fresh bread still warm from the oven. Lucas ate with evident appreciation, complimenting her cooking with such enthusiasm that she couldn't help but feel a flush of pleasure. This is the best meal I've had since leaving Texas, he declared, accepting a second helping. The Henderson Ranch cook tries, but her biscuits could serve as horseshoes in a pinch. Lillian laughed, surprising herself with the sound. How long had it been since she had truly laughed? You're too kind, she said. It's simple fare. Simple doesn't mean it can't be exceptional, Lucas replied. Some of the best things in life are simple. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than Lillian had anticipated. Lucas told her about growing up on his father's horse ranch, about his travels since leaving Texas, about the books he had read and the places he hoped to see someday. In turn, she found herself sharing stories of her childhood, of her mother's healing work, of her father's patient teaching. So that's why you gather at night, Lucas said when she explained about certain herbs being more potent when harvested by moonlight. You're continuing your mother's work. Lillian tensed, waiting for the judgment or skepticism that usually followed any mention of her mother's practices. Instead, Lucas nodded thoughtfully. My grandmother was similar, he said. Creek Indian on my mother's side. She knew plants that could heal just about anything. People called her a witch too, behind her back. To her face, they called her Madam and asked for her help when the doctor's medicines failed. Relief washed over Lillian. Exactly. My mother always said that people fear what they don't understand, but they'll set that fear aside quick enough when they need help. Human nature, Lucas agreed. Complicated and contradictory. After dinner, Lucas insisted on helping with the dishes despite Lillian's protests. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed plates back and forth. Each contact sent a curious warmth through Lillian's veins. When the kitchen was clean, Lucas reluctantly announced that he should be heading back to the Henderson Ranch. They'll be wondering where I've gotten to, he explained, and I've got early duties tomorrow. At the door, he paused. Miss O'Connor, Lillian, he corrected himself. I'd like to call on you again if you're amenable. Lillian hesitated. Part of her, the cautious, protective part, warned against allowing this man further into her life, but another part, long dormant, yearned for the connection he offered. I would like that, she admitted softly. His smile was like sunrise. Would next Sunday be acceptable? After church, she nodded. Yes, that would be fine. Until then, he said, placing his hat on his head. He took her hand gently and, to her surprise, raised it to his lips for the briefest of kisses. Thank you for a wonderful day. Lillian stood in the doorway, watching as he mounted his horse and rode away, raising his hand in a final farewell before disappearing around the bend in the path. Only when he was completely out of sight did she close the door and lean against it, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched. This is madness, she whispered to the empty room, complete madness. Yet she couldn't deny the lightness in her heart, the sense of possibility that had been absent for so long. One day in Lucas Kane's company had awakened something she had thought permanently dormant: hope. As promised, Lucas returned the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. Each visit followed a similar pattern: church, where they sat separately but exchanged glances. Then an afternoon at Lillian's cottage, sharing a meal and conversation that grew increasingly comfortable and revealing. During these visits, Lucas always found some small repair to make or chore to help with fixing a loose floorboard, reinforcing a chicken coop, helping to harvest the last of her garden before frost claimed it. He never arrived empty-handed, always bringing some thoughtful item: coffee, a book he thought she might enjoy, seeds for spring planting. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Whispers followed Lillian more persistently than ever when she visited the general store or attended church. Some were curious, others openly disapproving. Don't know what that Kane fellow sees in crazy Lillian, she overheard Mrs. Peterson saying to another woman after church one Sunday. Handsome man like that could have his pick of normal girls. Must be bewitched, the other woman replied with a knowing nod. Her mother was the same way, ensnaring men with those unnatural remedies of hers. Lillian had learned long ago to let such comments wash over her without response, but they stung nonetheless. She worried that eventually, Lucas would hear enough of these whispers to make him reconsider his interest in her. To her surprise, when the subject finally arose between them, it was Lucas who brought it up. "People are talking," he said matter-of-factly one afternoon in late November as they walked along the edge of the forest, collecting pine cones for winter kindling. "People always talk," Lillian replied, trying to keep her tone light. "Especially when there's nothing better to do in a small town." Lucas stopped walking and turned to face her. "Does it bother you, what they say about us?" She considered the question carefully. "Not what they say about us, no, but I worry that what they say about me might eventually bother you," his brow furrowed. "Why would it?" "Because no one wants to be associated with the town crazy," she said bluntly. "It doesn't matter to me, I've lived with their judgment for years, but you're still establishing yourself here. The Hendersons are respected. Being linked to me could make things difficult for you." Lucas's expression softened. "Lillian, do you really think I care what small-minded people think? If the Hendersons chose to dismiss me based on who I spend my time with, they wouldn't be people I'd want to work for anyway." "It's not that simple," she insisted. "Your future here, my future," he interrupted gently, "is something I intend to determine for myself, not have dictated by gossip and prejudice." He took a step closer to her. "Besides, Mr. Henderson actually approves. Says I've chosen a woman of substance rather than one of those frivolous town girls, as he calls them." This surprised her. "He said that, about me," Lucas nodded. "He remembers your father as an honest, hard-working man. And he's had some of your mother's remedies in the past, when his rheumatism was acting up." "I didn't know that," Lillian murmured, touched by this unexpected support. "People aren't always what they seem," Lucas said. "Some who smile to your face harbor ill thoughts, while others who keep their distance might hold you in high regard." They resumed walking, a comfortable silence settling between them. After a while, Lucas spoke again, his tone more hesitant than usual. "Lillian, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Her heart quickened. "Yes. The Henderson family is hosting a Christmas gathering at the ranch. Nothing fancy dinner, some music, the exchange of small gifts. They've invited all the ranch hands and encouraged us to bring someone if we wish." He cleared his throat. "I'd be honored if you would accompany me." Lillian stopped, a pine cone slipping from her fingers. A social gathering, with people who had shunned and mocked her for years. The thought was terrifying. "I don't think that would be wise," she said quietly. Disappointment flickered across Lucas's face. "May I ask why?" "You know why," she replied. "I would only make things uncomfortable for you, for the Hendersons, for everyone involved." "I disagree," Lucas said firmly. "And I think you underestimate yourself and others. The Hendersons specifically mentioned that you would be welcome." She looked at him in disbelief. "They did." Mrs. Henderson's exact words were, "Do invite Miss O'Connor." It's high time this town stopped treating her like an outcast for the crime of being different. Lillian didn't know how to respond. The idea that someone, especially someone of Mrs. Henderson's standing, might defend her was almost impossible to grasp. "I don't have anything suitable to wear," she said weakly, grasping for practical objections. Lucas smiled. "If that's your only concern, I think we can address it. There's still 3 weeks until Christmas." Still, she hesitated. "I haven't attended a social gathering since before my father died." "Then it's long overdue," he said gently. "Lillian, I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm asking because I believe you deserve to be included, to be treated with the respect that everyone else takes for granted." His sincerity was impossible to doubt. And despite her fear, a small part of her yearned to accept to step back into the world of normal social interactions, to stand beside this man who seemed to see value in her that others missed. "All right," she finally agreed. "I'll come." The smile that lit up his face was worth the anxiety her decision provoked. "You won't regret it," he promised. "And if anyone makes you uncomfortable, we'll leave immediately." As they continued their walk, Lucas's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. It was the first time he had held her hand for more than a momentary touch, and Lillian found herself holding her breath at the warm, secure feeling it created. "Is this all right?" he asked softly, seeming to sense her reaction. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked hand in hand back to her cottage, the simple contact speaking volumes that words could not yet express. That night, after Lucas had departed, Lillian opened the trunk where she kept her mother's few remaining possessions. At the bottom, carefully wrapped in muslin, was a dress of deep green wool, her mother's best, preserved all these years. Lillian had never worn it, feeling it somehow sacred to her mother's memory. But now she lifted it out, holding it against herself. With some alterations, it might fit. The color would complement her auburn hair and fair skin. For the first time in years, Lillian found herself caring about how she would appear to others, not out of insecurity, but out of a newfound desire to step back into the world with dignity. And perhaps, though she hardly dared admit it even to herself, to make Lucas proud to have her by his side. The 3 weeks before Christmas passed in a flurry of activity. Lillian altered her mother's dress, taking it in at the waist and letting out the hem to accommodate her slightly taller frame. Lucas continued his Sunday visits, each one strengthening the connection growing between them. He brought news of preparations for the gathering and reassurances that she would be warmly welcomed. On her increasingly rare nighttime excursions to the forest, Lillian found herself looking at familiar surroundings with new eyes. The world seemed less hostile, more filled with possibility. She began to wonder if perhaps her solitary existence had been as much her choice as the town's rejection a protective withdrawal, rather than an imposed isolation. Finally, Christmas Eve arrived, bringing with it a light dusting of snow that transformed Silver Creek into a scene from a storybook. Lucas came to collect Lillian in a borrowed buggy, looking handsome in his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his face freshly shaved. When Lillian emerged from her cottage in the green wool dress, a cream-colored shawl around her shoulders and her hair arranged in a simple but elegant knot, the expression on Lucas's face made all her efforts worthwhile. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Thank you," she replied, smoothing the skirt nervously. "It was my mother's dress." "She would be proud to see you in it," he assured her, offering his arm to help her into the buggy. The Henderson Ranch was the largest property in the area, its main house an impressive 2-story structure that stood as a testament to the family's prosperity. As their buggy approached, Lillian could see lights in every window and hear the faint sounds of music and laughter. Her courage nearly failed her then. "Lucas, I'm not sure I can do this." He covered her gloved hand with his own. "You can, and you won't be alone. I'll be right beside you the entire time." Mrs. Henderson herself greeted them at the door, a stout, cheerful woman with a no-nonsense manner that Lillian had always admired from a distance. "Miss O'Connor, how wonderful that you could join us," she exclaimed, taking Lillian's hands in her own. "That color is most becoming on you, my dear." "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Henderson," Lillian replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Nonsense, the pleasure is ours. Come in, it's much too cold to stand in doorways." Inside, the house was transformed by evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and candles that cast a warm glow over everything. A large tree stood in one corner of the parlor, decorated with paper ornaments, strings of berries, and small carved wooden figures. As Lucas predicted, the gathering was not large. The Henderson family, their ranch hands, and a few neighbors. Still, Lillian felt the weight of curious stares as she entered on Lucas's arm. She recognized most of the faces. Some were people who had openly mocked her, others who had simply ignored her existence. To her surprise, after the initial shock of her arrival wore off, most of the guests were polite, if not overly warm. Mrs. Henderson made a point of introducing Lillian to everyone as Miss O'Connor, whose mother was the finest healer this county has ever known. This unexpected acknowledgement of her mother's skills, rather than her rumored witchcraft, eased some of Lillian's tension. She found herself drawn into conversations about remedies for winter coughs and treatments for chilblains, her knowledge respectfully received by women who had previously crossed the street to avoid her. Throughout the evening, Lucas remained attentive without being possessive, giving her space to navigate social interactions while ensuring she never felt abandoned. When he noticed her becoming overwhelmed by the unfamiliar stimulation, he quietly guided her to a quieter corner or brought her a cup of punch, creating small respites within the gathering. During dinner, Lillian found herself seated between Lucas and Mr. Henderson, a taciturn but fair-minded man who surprised her by asking about her father's farming methods. "Joseph O'Connor knew this land better than most," he commented. "Always said you had his eye for growing things." "He taught me everything I know," Lillian replied, touched by the reference to her father. "Lands wasted sitting idle," Mr. Henderson continued. "Good soil on your property. Spring comes, you might consider planting more than just a kitchen garden." Lucas joined the conversation. "I was thinking the same. That south-facing slope would be perfect for a larger crop." "Been meaning to expand our vegetable production," Mr. Henderson mused. "Local demand exceeds what my wife can manage with her garden. Might be an opportunity there for someone with the right skills." The implication was clear: a potential business arrangement that could provide Lillian with additional income. She glanced at Lucas, who nodded encouragingly. "I would certainly consider it," she said, "though I'd need help with the plowing and heavy work." "Shouldn't be hard to find," Mr. Henderson replied with a significant look at Lucas. "Plenty of strong backs looking for extra work come spring." After dinner, one of the ranch hands produced a fiddle and another a harmonica. Furniture was pushed aside and dancing began, lively reels and jigs that filled the room with energy and laughter. Lucas turned to Lillian. "Would you do me the honor?" he asked, extending his hand. She hesitated. "I haven't danced in years." "Neither have I," he admitted with a grin. "We can relearn together." Their first attempts were awkward, both of them rusty and self-conscious. But as the music continued and they found their rhythm, Lillian felt a joy she had almost forgotten: the simple pleasure of moving in harmony with another person, of being part of something larger than herself. When the musicians shifted to a slower waltz, Lucas drew her closer, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. They moved together more confidently now, their bodies finding a natural synchronicity. "Are you glad you came?" he asked softly, his face close to hers. Lillian nodded. "Yes. Though I still can hardly believe I'm here, that any of this is happening." "Which part is hardest to believe?" There was something in his voice, a deeper question beneath the simple words. She met his gaze directly. "That someone like you would see something worthwhile in someone like me." Lucas's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Lillian, from the first moment I saw you, I recognized a strength in you that few possess. The courage to be yourself in a world that demands conformity. The dignity to carry your burdens without complaint. The compassion to continue your mother's healing work despite the ignorance and fear it inspires." The music continued around them, but Lillian barely noticed. The world had narrowed to just the two of them, to the earnest blue eyes that held hers with such sincerity. "I meant what I said that first night," Lucas continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Though I admit it was impulsive and perhaps inappropriate at the time." "That I was the woman you would marry?" Lillian asked, her heart beating so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Yes." He guided her through a turn, never breaking their gaze. "I knew then what I know with even greater certainty now, that you are remarkable, Lillian O'Connor, and that my life would be immeasurably richer with you in it." She hardly knew how to respond to such a declaration. We've known each other barely 2 months, she reminded him, though the objection felt hollow even to her own ears. Some things don't require years to know, he replied. Some truths reveal themselves in an instant if we're willing to see them. The music ended, but they remained standing close together, reluctant to break the connection of the moment. Around them, couples were separating, returning to conversations and refreshments, but Lucas kept hold of Lillian's hand. "Come with me," he said quietly. "There's something I want to show you." He led her through the house to a side door that opened onto a covered porch. Outside, the world was transformed by moonlight on fresh snow, the night clear and cold and beautiful beyond words. "I thought you might appreciate a moment of quiet," Lucas explained, closing the door behind them. "And I wanted to give you this away from curious eyes." From his pocket, he withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple string. "Merry Christmas, Lillian," he said, placing it in her hands. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small wooden box intricately carved with a pattern of leaves and flowers. When she opened it, a sweet melody began to play a music box. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touched beyond measure. "Look inside the lid," Lucas urged gently. Tilting the box toward the light streaming from the window, Lillian read the words carved there in flowing script. "To Lillian, may this remind you that beauty can be found in unexpected places, even in the darkest night. With deepest affection, Lucas." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I don't have anything for you," she said, distressed by the oversight. Lucas shook his head. "You've given me more than you know already." He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "But there is one gift you could give me if you're willing." "What is that?" she asked. "Your permission to court you properly," he said. "With the intention of making good on that declaration I made the night we met." Lillian looked up at him, this man who had somehow seen past all her careful defenses, who had brought light back into a life that had grown increasingly shadowed. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions within her. "I would like that very much." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, Lucas leaned forward. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle, yet filled with promise, the promise of a future neither of them had dared imagine before that fateful night when their paths had crossed. When they returned to the gathering, something had shifted between them, a certainty, a belonging that others seemed to sense without being told. Mrs. Henderson caught Lillian's eye across the room and gave her a knowing smile and approving nod. For the remainder of the evening, Lillian moved through the social interactions with new confidence. The stares and whispers that had once defined her existence in Silver Creek seemed to have lost their power to wound her. She was no longer just crazy Lillian, who gathered firewood at night. She was Lillian O'Connor, respected for her knowledge, valued for her skills, and cherished by a man who saw her true worth. As they drove back to her cottage in the moonlight, snow beginning to fall again in lazy, drifting flakes, Lucas reached over to tuck the blanket more securely around her. "Are you warm enough?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, and she meant it in more ways than one. The cold that had settled in her soul through years of isolation was thawing, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with physical temperature. "What are you thinking?" Lucas asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Lillian smiled, watching the snow catch in his hair and on his shoulders. "I'm thinking about how differently things might have gone if you hadn't spoken up that night, if you had just been another bystander watching me pick up scattered firewood." "I couldn't have stayed silent," he said simply. "Not when I saw the courage it took for you to walk that path every day, head held high despite the cruelty around you." "It wasn't courage," she admitted. "It was survival. I didn't know any other way to be." "That's what courage is, Lillian, continuing on when stopping would be easier." He guided the horses around a bend in the road. "When my father died, I wanted to give up. The ranch, the horses, everything we had built together, it all seemed pointless without him, but I kept going one day at a time because stopping wasn't really an option." "And now?" she asked. What keeps you going now? He looked at her, his expression visible even in the dim moonlight. Hope, possibility, the chance to build something new, something that honors the past without being chained to it. As they approached her cottage, Lillian felt none of the usual relief at returning to her sanctuary. Instead, she found herself wishing the journey could continue, that this night of transformation could be extended just a little longer. Lucas helped her down from the buggy and walked her to her door. Snow continued to fall around them, creating a private world of swirling white. "When can I see you again?" he asked, still holding her hand. "You know where to find me," she replied with a smile. "I won't be going anywhere." He touched her cheek gently. "Merry Christmas, Lillian. Merry Christmas, Lucas." Their second kiss was deeper than the first, a sealing of the unspoken promise between them. When they finally parted, Lillian felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her universe, as if all the stars had rearranged themselves into new and more beautiful constellations. Inside her cottage, she placed the music box on the small table beside her bed and opened it, letting the sweet melody fill the room. She thought of the words carved inside the lid, "Beauty can be found in unexpected places, even in the darkest night," and knew they were true. For years, she had ventured into the darkness of the forest, finding solace in its shadows and whispers. Now, she had found an unexpected light in the form of a man who had defended her dignity with a single, powerful declaration. "That's the woman I'll marry someday." As spring thawed the frozen landscape around Silver Creek, it seemed to Lillian that the town itself was thawing toward her. The change wasn't dramatic or universal. There were still those who crossed the street to avoid her or whispered behind their hands as she passed, but there was a noticeable shift in how many people treated her. Mrs. Henderson's approval had carried weight, opening doors that had previously been firmly closed. When Lillian visited the general store now, Walter greeted her by name and occasionally engaged in actual conversation rather than curt transactions. Several women had sought her out discreetly for remedies, acknowledging her mother's healing legacy rather than fearing it. But the most significant change was in Lillian herself. With Lucas's steady presence in her life, she had gradually begun to shed the protective shell she had built around herself over years of isolation. She smiled more readily, spoke more openly, and even ventured into town during busier hours rather than timing her visits to avoid as many people as possible. True to Mr. Henderson's suggestion at Christmas, Lillian had expanded her garden considerably that spring. Lucas had spent several weekends helping her plow and prepare the south-facing slope, turning the fertile soil into neat rows ready for planting. They had worked side by side, planning and discussing what crops would grow best and find ready markets in town. Their courtship had progressed with the same steady, unhurried certainty that characterized Lucas himself. He continued his Sunday visits without fail, but now also appeared on Wednesday evenings when his ranch duties allowed. They shared meals, worked on projects around her property, and talked for hours about everything and nothing: their pasts, their hopes, the changing seasons. Physical affection between them had grown naturally, from tentative hand holding to embraces and kisses that increasingly hinted at deeper desires. Yet Lucas never pressed beyond what Lillian was comfortable with, his respect for her boundaries as evident as his affection. By late May, as the first crops began to emerge in neat rows from the rich soil, Lillian found herself contemplating a future that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. A future that included Lucas Kane as more than just a suitor or friend. One particularly fine Sunday afternoon, they sat together on the porch of her cottage, taking a well-deserved rest after spending the morning weeding the expanding garden. Lucas had brought a picnic lunch: cold chicken, fresh bread, and early strawberries, which they had enjoyed in the dappled shade of the old oak tree that stood sentinel beside the cottage. "The tomato plants are coming along nicely," Lucas commented, his arm comfortably around Lillian's shoulders as they watched clouds drift across the azure sky. "And those beans you planted should be ready for first picking soon. Mrs. Henderson has already arranged to purchase whatever we can produce," Lillian replied, still somewhat amazed at how quickly her status had shifted from outcast to valued supplier. "And Dr. Morris asked if I might cultivate more of the medicinal herbs my mother used to provide." Lucas smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I told you people would come around once they remembered how valuable your knowledge is." "It's not just that," she said thoughtfully. "It's you, too. Your belief in me made others reconsider their judgments." "I only reminded them of what they should have seen all along," he replied. "You did the rest yourself, Lillian." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to birds calling from the forest edge and the occasional distant lowing of cattle from neighboring ranches. "I had a letter from my sister yesterday," Lucas said finally, his voice casual though Lillian sensed an undercurrent of something significant. "How is Catherine?" she asked. Over the months, she had heard many stories about Lucas's older sister and her family in San Francisco. "Well, very well, in fact. Her husband's shipping business is thriving." He paused. "She's extended an invitation for me to visit this summer, says it's been too long since she's seen her only brother." Lillian felt a sudden chill despite the warm afternoon. "Will you go?" Lucas turned to face her directly. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you would consider accompanying me." His blue eyes held her steadily. "As my wife." For a moment Lillian wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. "Your wife." Lucas took her hands in his. "I love you, Lillian O'Connor. I think I began falling in love with you that very first night, when I saw your dignity in the face of cruelty. Every day since then has only deepened that feeling." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "This was my mother's," he explained. "She made me promise to give it only to a woman of substance and character, someone who would understand its value beyond the mere monetary." Lillian stared at the ring, then at Lucas's earnest face. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still the woman who gathers firewood at night, who talks to plants and believes in moon phases. The town may be more accepting now, but I'll never be completely conventional." Lucas smiled. "Thank God for that. I fell in love with you precisely because you aren't conventional, Lillian, because you have the courage to live according to your own truths rather than others' expectations." He held the ring between them, a tangible symbol of his commitment. "I'm asking you to build a life with me here in Silver Creek, where we can continue what you've started with the garden and your mother's healing traditions. Or in California, if you'd prefer a fresh start. Or anywhere else that calls to us." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming joy. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural. "And yes, I will marry you, Lucas Kane." His face lit with happiness as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand alone. When he kissed her, Lillian felt as though her heart might burst with the fullness of her emotions. "When?" she asked when they finally separated, both a little breathless. "As soon as you wish," Lucas replied, "though I thought perhaps we might wait until after harvest so we can use the proceeds to establish our home properly." "Our home," Lillian repeated, savoring the phrase. "Here, you mean?" "At the cottage," Lucas nodded. "If that's what you want. It's your family's place with all those memories and connections. Though I must admit, I've been thinking it could use an addition, another bedroom or two, perhaps a larger kitchen." The implication of children, of a growing family, made Lillian's heart swell even further. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." They spent the remainder of the afternoon making plans for the wedding, for improvements to the cottage, for their trip to San Francisco to meet Catherine and her family. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the flourishing garden, Lucas reluctantly rose to leave. "I should get back to the ranch," he said. though it gets harder to leave each time. Lillian walked with him to where his horse was tethered. It won't be for much longer, she reminded him, the weight of the ring on her finger a constant, wonderful reminder of their commitment. He drew her into a final embrace. No, not much longer. Soon you'll be stuck with me permanently, Mrs. Kane to be. I can think of worse fates, she teased, rising on tiptoe to kiss him once more. As she watched him ride away, Lillian touched the ring on her finger, still hardly believing the turn her life had taken. From isolation and whispered mockery to love and respect, all because one man had the courage to see beyond appearances and prejudice. That night, as she prepared for bed, Lillian opened the music box Lucas had given her at Christmas, letting its sweet melody fill the cottage. She thought about the coming months, the harvest, the wedding, the beginning of a shared life with the man who had defended her dignity with a simple, powerful declaration that had proven prophetic. That's the woman I'll marry someday. And so it would be. The wedding of Lucas Kane and Lillian O'Connor took place on a perfect September day, with the mountains ablaze in autumn colors and the air crisp with the promise of changing seasons. They exchanged vows in the small church in Silver Creek, which was filled beyond capacity, not only with the Henderson family and ranch employees who had become Lucas's friends, but with townspeople who had gradually come to accept and even respect Lillian over the months of her courtship. Mrs. Henderson had insisted on hosting the celebration afterward at the ranch, transforming the same space that had witnessed their Christmas Eve revelation into a festive setting for a wedding reception. Tables groaned under the weight of food, much of it prepared using vegetables from Lillian's now thriving garden. "Never seen such tomatoes," Walter commented as he filled his plate, "or such squash, got the touch, that girl does." "Woman," corrected his wife gently. And yes, she always did. We just weren't wise enough to see it. Lillian, radiant in a cream-colored dress she had made herself, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil, moved through the celebration with grace and joy. Lucas rarely left her side, his pride and happiness evident in every glance, every touch, every smile directed at his new wife. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Lucas guided Lillian away from the main gathering for a moment of privacy on the same porch where he had given her the music box and first kissed her. "Happy, Mrs. Kane?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she confirmed, leaning into his embrace. "Though I still find it hard to believe this isn't some wonderful dream. If it is," he murmured against her hair, "then I never want to wake from it." They returned to the celebration hand in hand, to dance and laugh and accept good wishes from people who, less than a year ago, had shunned Lillian as an outcast. Later that night, Lucas brought his bride home to the cottage, now their home, which had been transformed during the weeks leading up to the wedding. True to his word, Lucas had added an extension with a larger bedroom for them and space for the family they both hoped to create. The kitchen had been expanded, with proper shelving for Lillian's herbs and remedies. Even the barn had been improved, with additional stalls for the horses Lucas had acquired and space for the wagon they would need to transport their garden produce to market. As they crossed the threshold together, Lucas surprised Lillian by sweeping her into his arms. "Traditional," he explained with a grin, carrying her inside. "And practical, given all the work we've done on these floors. Wouldn't want you to trip on your wedding day." The cottage was warm and welcoming, with a fire already laid in the hearth courtesy of Mr. Henderson's son, who had ridden ahead to prepare for their arrival. Fresh flowers stood in vases throughout the main room, their scent mingling with the familiar aromas of herbs and wood smoke that defined the space. "Welcome home, wife," Lucas said softly, setting Lillian on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Welcome home, husband," she replied, the words still new and wonderful on her tongue. The transition from courtship to marriage was as natural as the changing seasons. There were adjustments, of course, learning each other's habits and rhythms, finding ways to share space that had previously been solely Lillian's domain. But these were small matters compared to the joy of waking each morning to the sight of Lucas beside her, of sharing meals and work and dreams. Their trip to San Francisco was delayed until the following spring, when the garden was planted, and they could leave it in the capable hands of a local boy Lucas had hired to help with the expanding operation. Catherine welcomed them with open arms, delighted to finally meet the woman who had captured her brother's heart. "He writes of nothing else," she confided to Lillian during a moment alone. "I've never seen him so settled, so content. You've given him what he's been searching for all these years, a purpose, a home, a true partnership." "He's given me the same," Lillian replied, watching through the window as Lucas played with his nieces and nephews in the garden of Catherine's elegant home. "And more, he gave me back my place in the world when I thought I'd lost it forever." The 2 weeks in San Francisco were a revelation for Lillian, who had never traveled beyond the immediate vicinity of Silver Creek. Lucas showed her the ocean, took her to theaters and restaurants, introduced her to the vibrant, cosmopolitan life of the growing city. Yet for all its excitement and novelty, both of them were ready to return home when the visit ended. "Did you ever consider staying?" Lillian asked as their train carried them back toward the mountains and valleys of their home. "When your sister first invited you to join them in San Francisco, I mean," Lucas considered the question. "Briefly," he admitted, "after my father died, when everything familiar seemed tainted by grief. But I knew even then that I belonged to the land in a way that wouldn't translate to city life. I just didn't know which land exactly until I found Silver Creek, until I found you." By the time they returned, spring had fully established itself in the valley. Their garden was thriving under the care of young Thomas, the local boy who had proven to have a natural gift for growing things. The remedies Lillian prepared now had a steady stream of customers, her mother's healing legacy finally receiving the recognition it deserved. Life settled into a rhythm: work and rest, planting and harvest, the slow, steady building of a shared future. Lucas continued to work part-time for the Hendersons, though increasingly he devoted his energy to their own growing enterprise. By the following year, they had expanded beyond vegetables to include berry bushes and fruit trees, with plans for a small orchard that would eventually produce enough for modest commercial sales. It was during the second autumn of their marriage, as they harvested apples from the young trees Lucas had planted as a wedding gift, that Lillian shared the news she had suspected for several weeks. "I think we'll need that second bedroom sooner than we might have planned," she said, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. Lucas froze, an apple halfway to the basket. "Lillian, are you saying?" She nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. "If my calculations are correct, we should welcome our child in late spring." The basket of apples was forgotten as Lucas crossed to her in 2 long strides, gathering her in his arms with a whoop of joy that startled birds from nearby trees. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around, mindful even in his excitement to be gentle. "A baby," he said when he finally set her down, his hands cradling her face. "Our baby. Are you pleased?" she asked, though his reaction had already answered the question. "Pleased doesn't begin to cover it," he assured her. Ecstatic, terrified, overwhelmed with gratitude, all of those and more. Their daughter, Sarah Catherine Kane, was born on a perfect May morning in 1875, with Mrs. Henderson serving as midwife and Lucas pacing anxiously outside until the infant's first cry rang out. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and from her earliest days showed signs of the same quiet determination that characterized both her parents. As Sarah grew, so did the Kane family's standing in Silver Creek. The garden had expanded into a proper farm, with Lucas and Lillian supplying vegetables, fruits, and medicinal herbs not only to the local community, but to neighboring towns as well. The cottage had been further enlarged to accommodate their growing needs. though it retained the essential character that made it uniquely theirs. On Sarah's third birthday, as they celebrated with a small gathering of friends including the Hendersons and even Walter, and his wife Lucas pulled Lillian aside for a private moment. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they watched their daughter showing Mrs. Henderson a flower she had picked. "When we first met," Lillian leaned against him, content in a way she once could never have imagined. "Often," she admitted, "though it seems like another lifetime now, another person." "Not another person," Lucas corrected gently. "The same remarkable woman I saw then, just happier, perhaps, more at peace." She turned in his arms to face him. "And what about you, still satisfied with your impulsive declaration that night?" His answer was a kiss that, even after years of marriage, still had the power to make her heart race. "More than satisfied," he murmured against her lips. "Grateful beyond words that I had the sense to recognize what was right in front of me." Sarah came running over then, demanding their attention for some new discovery, and the moment shifted into the joyful chaos of family life. But later that night, after their daughter was asleep and they sat together on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Lillian returned to the conversation. "I never thanked you properly," she said, her head resting on Lucas's shoulder. "For what?" he asked, his fingers idly stroking her arm. "For seeing me when everyone else had decided not to look. For defending my dignity that night, for changing everything." Lucas shook his head. "You're giving me too much credit. You were always extraordinary, Lillian." "I just happened to be the first person in Silver Creek with eyes clear enough to see it." She smiled at his characteristically modest response. "Well, whatever the case, I'm grateful, for you, for this life we've built together." "As am I," he assured her. "Though there's one thing I've always wondered." "What's that?" "That first night, when I helped you gather the wood and made that rather forward declaration, what did you really think of me?" "You must have thought I was completely mad," Lillian laughed softly. "I did, actually. Or at least dangerously impulsive. But there was something in your eyes when you said it, a certainty, a recognition that stayed with me. I think some part of me knew even then that you meant it, that you saw something in me worth seeing." "Everything about you is worth seeing," Lucas replied, drawing her closer. "Every day I discover something new to love." As night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about the day, about plans for the coming season's planting, about Sarah's latest accomplishments. The life they had created together was not without challenges, no life ever is, but it was rich with purpose, mutual respect, and deep, abiding love. And if the townsfolk of Silver Creek still occasionally remarked on the unusual circumstances of their meeting, it was now with fondness rather than mockery. The story had become something of a local legend, how Lucas Kane had defended the dignity of a woman everyone else had dismissed, how he had recognized in Lillian O'Connor qualities that others were too blind to see. "That's the woman I'll marry someday," he had declared on a cold night in 1872, when Lillian was struggling to gather scattered firewood from the muddy street. And so it had come to pass, exactly as he predicted, not through magic or fate, but through the simple, powerful alchemy of two people recognizing in each other the possibility of a shared future, a shared purpose, a shared love that would sustain them through all the seasons of their lives together. In the years that followed, as their family grew to include a son, William Lucas, born 2 years after Sarah, and their farm expanded to become one of the most prosperous in the region, Lillian and Lucas never forgot the unlikely beginning of their journey together. They told the story to their children, who would eventually tell it to their own children, a reminder that love can be found in the most unexpected circumstances, and that sometimes all it takes to change a life is one person willing to see beyond appearances to the truth that lies beneath. And though Lillian no longer needed to gather firewood at night, Lucas made sure their supply was always ample. She still occasionally ventured into the forest after dark, now with her husband and children beside her, to teach them the wisdom her mother had passed to her. That the night had its own magic, its own beauty, its own lessons to impart to those patient enough to listen. In those moments, beneath the canopy of stars, surrounded by the family that had once seemed an impossible dream, Lillian would catch Lucas's eye across the flickering light of a lantern and see in his smile the same recognition that had transformed her life that fateful night in Silver Creek. "That's the woman I'll marry someday." Words spoken on impulse, fulfilling a promise that neither of them could have fully understood at the time. A declaration that had sparked a love story as enduring as the mountains that sheltered their home, as deep as the roots they had put down together in soil that had once known only solitude, and as true as the hearts that had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most.